Welcome to FGCU's workshop on APA format. This video will teach you the basics of using APA. APA stands for American Psychological Association, and it is a citation style. It tells us how we format our papers, how we give credit to someone when we're using their ideas, their thoughts, their data, their intellectual property in general. And what APA is interested in is consistency. It wants everyone who's operating in APA all over the world to give the same information when they cite from the same source, to format their paper in the same way, etc. Because of this, there are very particular rules for just about everything in APA. So it's very important that you have some form of guide before formatting something in APA. If you click on the screen now, it will take you to a guide. Another thing to mention is that although APA has lots of rules and guidelines, your professor or the market, perhaps, that you're writing for will trump APA's guidelines. Having said that, we are going to first talk about the general format of an APA document. On the screen, you can see a very typical page in APA format, and there's a few things that we can gather from this. First, you'll notice that this is all double-spaced. Every page of an APA document is double-spaced. Next, you'll see that this is 12-point font, and it's in Times New Roman. You'll also notice that there are 1-inch margins all around. Since this is the first page of the actual body of an APA document, it has a title at the very top of the page. You'll see that this title is not italicized, it's not underlined. Next, you'll see examples of levels of headings. The first example is of a level 1 heading, and that is bolded and centered. The second example is of a level 2 heading, and it's bolded and it's kept on the left margin. And the third example is a level 3 heading, and it is indented, bolded, and then there's a period, and then you have your writing. Finally, at the very top of the page, you'll see the running head. The running head for, on most pages of an APA document, you're going to have your title all in capital letters in the left corner. And then on the right corner, you're going to have your page numbers, and those should be sequential. So the very first page should be 1 all the way down to your very last page, which should be numbered the last page of your document. That's the basic format of an APA document, but there are a few special pages that we should talk about. First is your title page. The first thing to notice is that in the upper half of the title page, there is the title of the work, the writer, and the affiliated university. All of this information is centered and double-spaced. The next thing to notice is the running head, the top of the page, which is a little different than the running head we saw on the other page. Here you still have the page number in the corner, you still have the all capitalized title, but before that title you have the words running head, colon, and then you have the title. And this is something that can be a little tricky to do, so I'm going to show you how to do it on Word. First thing you do is go to a page that is not your title page. This page is not my title page. Click in the header to open it up, and under Header and Footer Tools Design, you go to Page Numbers and you insert the page number. There we go. Next thing you're going to do is type all capitalized your title. In the running head, the title has to be less than 50 characters, which includes spaces. Mine is longer than that, so I'm going to use a shortened title. Then I'm going to hit Tab twice to get my page number over to the right. Next, because Word is Satan and the worst, we're going to change the font to make sure that the font is the same on every page. Ta-da! We now have the running head on every page, but we don't want it on the first page. So I fix this as we go again in the header, and we go under Options, we click Different First Page. Now that header's gone, and we repeat the process. we want to insert page number. And again, you're going to have to check because Word is the worst. Make sure everything is Times New Roman. Bam, beautiful. The only other thing to mention is that your actual title here, that should be 12 words or less. There you go. Before moving on to in-text citations, we're going to talk about the format of one more special piece of the document, of an APA document, and that's the abstract. If you are required to have an abstract, your abstract will be the second page of your paper. And at the very top, you will have abstract written. And it's not italicized, it's not underlined, it's not anything else like that. You have the same running head. But kind of strangely, your paragraph is not indented. An abstract is only one paragraph long, and it's not indented. It's just the way it is. The purpose of an abstract is to give any reader a very clear idea of what the entire paper is about, just from reading something very short. So if you are a time-strapped graduate student, you can read a bunch of abstracts and get a pretty good idea of what all the papers are about, so you know that you're not wasting your time reading something that's not useful to you. So it's one paragraph. It's generally 150 to 250 words long, and you also notice keywords often appear right after the abstract. This is indented, and keywords is actually italicized, and then you have a colon, and listed there are words that are important parts of the paper. So in my fake one here, it's all about pizza. So there's a bunch of stuff about pizza there, because those are the important words. So if someone was searching for this, those keywords would show up. Having talked about the general format of an APA document, now we're going to talk a little bit about in-text citations. And in-text citations are where you indicate that you're using someone else's intellectual property in the actual body of your work. So for example, if you're using someone's words, you have to have an in-text citation. If you're using someone else's idea, you have to have an in-text citation. If you're using someone else's data, etc. And when you do an in-text citation, how you do the citation depends on how you are using someone else's intellectual property. So for example, if you are summarizing, which is when you take a lot of text and you condense it into a lot less words, or if you're paraphrasing, which is when you take someone's ideas and put them in your own words, it's sufficient to just provide the author's name and the year of publication. And on the screen is an example of that. You'll see that if you mention the author's name in a signaling phrase or in an actual sentence, you immediately follow that by the year of publication in parentheses. If you don't give the writer's name in the actual sentence, you want to give the author's name and the publication date in a parenthetical citation. And you want to give that parenthetical citation when you stop using a writer's intellectual property. Usually that means at the end of the sentence, which is one of the examples on the screen. Sometimes that happens in the middle of a sentence. So for example, you use someone's intellectual property, and then the remaining part of your sentence you draw your own conclusions. You would indicate that by putting the parenthetical citation in the middle of the sentence. Sometimes you will not have a date of publication. If you don't have a date of publication, you use N period D period in place of the date. That's for summary and paraphrase. When you're direct quoting, it's essential that you give the page number. So on the screen, you'll see that when you directly quote, it looks very similar to when you paraphrase or when you summarize. If you give the writer's name in the actual sentence, you follow that by the year, and then you put the page citation directly after the actual quotation. So if that's at the end of the sentence, that's where you give your page number. If it's in the middle of a sentence, that's where you give your page number. If you do not mention the writer's name in the actual sentence, then you put that author's name, you put the author's name, and you put the year of publication in the parentheses with the page number. One last thing to mention is that when giving the page number, P period is the abbreviation for one page. So if you're only using one page in your citation, that's what you use. Second example there is when you have more than one page and you use the abbreviation PP period. So it's if you have more than one page. Sometimes you will also not have a page number. When you don't have a page number, you are encouraged to use a paragraph number. Usually you won't have a page number when it's something like, let's say, an online document. If that happens, you're encouraged to give the paragraph number, putting PARA period before the number. The direct quote example that we just spoke about was what you do for a short quote. Occasionally you will have a longer quote. That is when the quote is 40 or more words. And when you have a quote that is 40 or more words, what you actually do is you don't use quotation marks. You set it apart in a block. And on the screen you'll see an example of that. You'll see two actually. So you'll notice that there are no, these are both 40 or more words, and there's no more quotation marks. It's all set apart in a block, which is a 1/2 inch indent. And you have the parenthetical citation coming at the end of the quotation, but unlike with the short quotes, the punctuation comes before the parenthetical citation. And when you're leading into a block quote, there's two examples there of ways you can lead into it that are correct. One example is when you don't have a complete sentence that's leading into the block quote. In that case, you just use a comma and then you enter your block quote. The other example is when you have a complete sentence and then you're entering your block quote, and there you use a colon. That's the basics for in-text citation for APA format, but there are a number of particularities that I would also like to talk about. All the examples we gave were dealing with works that there was only one author. So often you'll have works that have more than one author. And here is a table on the screen that will show you what to do. For example, if you have two authors, then you just write out the name when you give the author's name in the actual sentences. So in this case we have Walker and Allen. If it's in the parenthetical citation, you use an ampersand, which is a symbol for an and, instead of writing out the actual word. Below that you'll see that there are rules for if there are 3, 4, 5, and 6 or more authors. Some things to note: all the way up until there's 6 or more, the very first citation, you spell out all the writers' names. And then in the subsequent citations, so citation 2 or 3 or whatever, you use the abbreviation et al., which means and others in Latin. If you have more than 6, then you use et al. The whole time. And finally, at the very bottom there, you have what you do if you have a group author. So if there's a publication of something it's not by a person author, it's by, let's say, a university or something. That's how you do it. You use the university's name just as you would the author's name. If it is easy to abbreviate, you give the abbreviation on the first citation, and then you use the abbreviation afterwards. If it is not easy, then you just spell out the whole thing. Another type of citation that students sometimes have is when they are citing a source that was cited in another source. Officially, APA discourages this. If you find a source that cited another source and you want to use the source that was cited in the other source, you should just go to that original source. But sometimes this is not possible, sometimes it's out of print, and sometimes this just isn't realistic with our time. So when you do this, there is a way to indicate that you are citing a source that was cited in another source. So you found this original source in a different source. How you do this is, in the parenthetical, you give the source you found the original source in. And before that, just as you would for any other citation. But you indicate that this is where the source you're talking about was found by writing as cited in before the actual citation. And there's an example on the screen. And you always want to mention the original source, the source that was cited in the other source. You want to mention that in the actual sentences. And again, here's an example. Before moving on, one last thing I wanted to mention. Often students will be, let's say they're summarizing or they're paraphrasing a lot from a single source for whatever reason. So let's say there's 4 or 5 sentences in a row, and all of them are someone else's ideas. All of them are, let's say, summary of another source. So they all are technically intellectual property of somebody else. Students will sometimes ask if they need to have a citation, an in-text citation each time. Officially, APA style says, give the citation for every sentence. The reason why is because if you don't have an in-text citation, it makes it appear that this is not someone else's intellectual property. You can make it look a little less weird by changing up whether or not you give the writer's name in the actual sentence or in the parenthetical. One final point before moving on to the reference list. The bibliographic information listed in the reference list and the APA's in-text citation have a direct relationship. So we went over some exceptions here. For example, if you have a source that has a group author, you'll notice that you use the group as the author. Well, on the screen now is an example of an in-text citation when there is no group author. It's an anonymous work, and you use the title of the work as the author. And you'll see that there's a direct relationship between that and the actual bibliographic citation in the reference list. So if you're able to cite a source at the end of your paper, using that you can usually figure out the information you're supposed to give for the in-text citation. The reference page is the final page of your APA document, and it gives information for all the sources that you use. And it has some formatting particularities that I wanted to show you very quickly. First, you'll notice that it still has the running head at the top of the page that you had throughout the rest of your document. At the very top of the page, there's references centered, and that's not italicized and it's not bolded. And then you'll see that the actual citations are in alphabetical order. And finally, there is a thing called a hanging indent. Hanging indent is when the first line is the only one that's not indented. And I'm going to show you how to do that in Word. Here's your reference page where everything's perfect, but you don't have a hanging indent. The first thing you need to do is you need to go to View and select the ruler, which is under the Show. Then you select everything and you go to your ruler, and you'll see that there's a triangle at the very top, there's a triangle in the center, and there's a little rectangle on the bottom. The center triangle is for the hanging indent. Move that over 5 spaces. Beautiful. For the reference citations, more than almost anything else we've talked about, it's very, very important that you have a guide because there's a lot of particularities for every kind of source. But here are some common ones. The first is an example of a book source and a few things that you can notice. First, you have the writer's last name followed by a comma, and then you have the first name initial. If there was a middle name, you would also give the middle initial there. If there's more than one writer, you'll have a comma after the first and middle initial, and then you give the next writer in the same form, unless it is the final writer. If that's the case, you give an ampersand, and then you have the final writer. This is followed by the year in parentheses, and then you have the book title. And you'll notice with the book title that only the very first word is capitalized, the rest is not capitalized. And in this case, we have a subtitle, so we have the colon, and we have the rest of the title. The subtitle also has the very first word capitalized. Because it's the title of a book, the title is italicized. That's followed by the place of publication. You have the city, followed by the abbreviated state. Then you have a colon. And finally, you have the publisher. Giving the publisher, you want to use a shortened form of the publisher's name. So for example, if the publisher is Little, Brown and Company, you might just write Little and Brown. But you do want to retain words such as association, books, and press, such as if you have a university press. You'll find more detailed information about that in APA Guide. So that was your basic example from a book. And now we'll look at an example of an article. Here, very similarly, you'll see we start with the writer's names, followed by the year of publication. Next, we have the article title, and this is given just like the title of a book is, except it's not italicized, so the very first word is the only one that's capitalized. You have a period. Then we have the italicized title of the journal, and titles of journals are different than titles of books or titles of articles. Here we do have different capitalization. You capitalize all the principal words, so you don't want to capitalize a, and, the, or any preposition, or any conjunction, unless they are at the beginning. Everything else you want to capitalize. And this is followed by the volume and issue number. And then finally you have the page numbers. And this is where, in the two examples we have on there, this is where things deviate, because in the first example we have what's known as a digital object identifier. In the other example we don't. Digital object identifiers are numbers that are given to articles, particularly when they're found online, or can be found online, that are unique. They're kind of like serial numbers. And APA encourages you to give those when you can. If you can't, then you give where you retrieve this from. And if you didn't retrieve this from online, you retrieved it from a book source, you can find out how to do that in an APA manual, but this commonly people get them online. This concludes FGCU's workshop on APA format. I hope that you've learned about some of the basics. For more information, please visit our website or come see us in the Writing Center.